Between 1960s to late 1970s, if a mentally impaired child was born, doctors recommend you place them in foster care and move on with your life. Many state-ran board schools housed these children. While many had its controversy, one of the most notable was the WillowBrook State School. This is the story of WillowBrook State School, New York's great sin. WillowBrook State School was a state-ran institution for children with mental disabilities located in the Willowbrook neighborhood on Staten in New York City from 1947 until 1987. Conditions and questionable medical practices and experiments prompted Senator Robert F. Kennedy to call it a, quote, snake pit. Public outcry led to its closure in 1987 and the federal civil rights legislation protecting people with disabilities. By 1965, WillowBrook housed over 6,000 mentally disabled people despite having a maximum capacity of 4,000. Senator Robert F. Kennedy toured the institution in 1965 and proclaimed that individuals in the overcrowded facility were living in filth and dirt, their clothing in rags, and rooms less comfortable and cheerful than the cages in which we put animals in a zoo.
Well, I visited the State Institution for the Mentally Retarded, and I think particularly at WillowBrook that we have a situation that borders on a snake pit, and that the children live in filth, that many of our fellow citizens are suffering tremendously because lack of attention, lack of imagination, lack of adequate manpower. There's very little future for the children or for those who are in these institutions. Both need a tremendous overhauling. I'm not saying that those who are the attendants there or the ones that run the institution are at fault. I think all of us are at fault. And I think it's just it's long overdue that something be done about it.
Former WillowBrook employee of 11 years, Diane Bugliagli, said that individuals were denied their basic rights to humanity while living at the school. She said prisons allocate 80 square feet per inmate. WillowBrook provided only 35 square feet per resident, with no place to put a treasured item, no place to put their personal possessions. The residential school's reputation was that of a warehouse for New York City's mentally disabled people, many of whom were presumably abandoned there by their families, foster care agencies, or other systems designed to care for them. Donna J. Stone, an advocate for mentally disabled children as well as victims of child abuse, gained access to the school by passing as a recent social work graduate. She then shared her observation with members of the press. Jane Curtin was the first reporter to write a story about WillowBrook State School, but it wasn't until Geraldo Rivera, then an investigative reporter for WABC-TV in New York, conducted a series of investigations at WillowBrook uncovering a host of deplorable conditions. The expose entitled WillowBrook: The Last Great Disgrace garnered national attention and won a Peabody Award for Rivera.
I first heard of this big place with the pretty sounding name because of a call I received from a member of the WillowBrook staff, Dr. Michael Wilkins. The doctor told me he'd just been fired because he'd been urging parents with children in one of the buildings, building number 6, to organize so they could more effectively demand improved conditions for their children. The doctor invited me to see the conditions he was talking about, so unannounced and unexpected by the school administration, we toured building number 6. The doctor had warned me that it would be bad. It was horrible. There was one attendant for perhaps 50 severely and profoundly retarded children, lying on the floor naked and smeared with their own feces. They were making a pitiful sound, a kind of mournful wail that it's impossible for me to forget. This is what it looked like, this is what it sounded like, but how can I tell you about the way it smelled? It smelled of filth, it smelled of disease, and it smelled of death.
In his series of investigations at WillowBrook, he discovered overcrowding, inadequate sanitary facilities, and physical and sexual abuse of residents by members of school staff. Dr. Michael stated in Rivera's interview that the facility was severely understaffed with only 1 to 3 people tasked to oversee wards of 70 children.
We've just seen something that's probably the most horrible thing I've ever seen in my life. Is that typical of ward life?
Yes, there are 5,300 patients at WillowBrook, which is the largest institution for the mentally retarded in the world. The ones that we saw were the most severely and profoundly retarded. There are thousands there like that, not going to school, sitting on the ward all day, not being talked to by anyone, only 1 or 2 or 3 people to take care of 70 people on the ward, sharing the same toilet, contracting the same diseases together. 100% of patients at WillowBrook contract hepatitis within 6 months of being in the institution. Most patients at some time in their life have parasites. The incidence of pneumonias is greater than any other group of people that I think exist in this country. Trauma is severe because these patients are left together on a ward, 70 retarded people, basically unattended, fighting for a small scrap of paper on the floor to play with, fighting for the attention of the attendants who are overworked, trying to clean them, feed them, clothe them, and if possible pay a little attention to them and work with them and develop their intelligence. But what in fact happens is that they go downhill.
Who's in charge here, Jerry? This is Mrs. Nixon. I'm Congressman Biaggi. How are you? Why are these patients unclothed?
We don't have enough clothing. We don't have the proper help to keep clothing on them. We have a few nudists that will not keep clothes on. They will pull them off. But most of all, we don't have the help to keep the kids properly dressed.
You're talking about more money for the institution.
Well, that we could use because then we will have more help.
How understaffed are you?
Very understaffed. There are days we have 4 or 5 attendants to take care of 100.
Condition in a very beautiful ground, very well-built buildings. Where inside we have housed the children of many of our citizens who are subjected to what appears to be the worst possible conditions I've ever seen in my life. I've visited penal institutions all over the country. I've visited hospitals all over the country. I've visited the worst brigs in the military. Nothing's like it. I've never seen anything like it.
When the state of New York entered a period of economic retrenchment 2 years ago, a hiring freeze was clamped on this and other institutions in the Department of Mental Hygiene. In the intervening months, WillowBrook lost 600 employees through attrition. For the budget for fiscal 71-72, the governor recommended a hold-the-line appropriation of $630 million for the Mental Hygiene Department. The legislature, seeking to trim the waste and fat from the budget, cut it down to about $600 million. Then the governor decided that even $600 million was too much and cut it even further, all the way down to $580 million. WillowBrook lost another 200 employees, and a situation that 2 years ago was bad became hopeless.
Residents of the WillowBrook State School were often left wandering the halls and school grounds unsupervised with nothing to do for hours at a time. As a feature of the times, all who ended up in WillowBrook were treated more or less the same despite differences in needs and the common reality of early childhood misdiagnosis. Around 2 months after the television special, a class action lawsuit were filed against the state of New York by the parents of 5,000 residents of WillowBrook in federal court on March 17, 1972. As the light of the camera illuminates in rooms that appears to be completely dark, lurking beneath the negative publicity was an even more heinous contour to the story of WillowBrook. Throughout the first decade of its operation, outbreaks of hepatitis, primarily hepatitis A, were common at the school. This led to controversial medical studies being carried out there between the late 1950s and the 70s by medical researchers Saul Krugman and Robert W. McCollum. In 1955, they began using patients as human experiments for the treatment of hepatitis, as he would continue to do for about 20 years. Krugman's research at WillowBrook extended medical knowledge of the disease. At the same time, Krugman's methods have become among the most remembered among American cases of bioethics. Krugman deliberately infected the mentally disabled patients of WillowBrook with samples of hepatitis synthesized from feces of 6 infected patients and incorporated into the patient's food and chocolate milk. Krugman argued that rather the hepatitis infection ran 90% within WillowBrook, so the chances his human host would never have come down with the disease was very low. He also contested that it was the best health scenario for these non-consenting patients, as they were to be under close supervision and care they would not find anywhere else in this ward. Krugman, who died in 1995, defended the ethics of his studies to the very end. The success of the class action lawsuit brought in 1972 gave way to New York State's 1975 consent decree, making the state find alternatives to WillowBrook for the mentally disabled to live. In 1983, the state of New York announced plans to close WillowBrook, which had been renamed the Staten Island Development Center in 1974. By the end of March 1986, the number of residents housed there had dwindled to 250, and the last children left the grounds on September 17, 1987. In 1989, a portion of the land was acquired by the city of New York with the intent of using it to establish a new campus for the College of Staten Island, and the new campus opened at WillowBrook in 1993. The buildings now stand as a reminder of a time when American society more clearly failed its mentally disabled citizens and treated them so brazenly as less than human. But along the way, the lessons learned from WillowBrook influenced policies engineered to protect the disabled as they do to this day, like the Protection and Advocacy System of the Development Disabilities Assistance and Bill of Rights Act and the Education for All Handicapped Children Act. Both passed in 1975.
And the average feeding time per patient, which should be 20 or 30 minutes, went down to 2 and 3 minutes.
Many of the profoundly retarded children aren't capable of feeding themselves. In my building, we had no staff to train them in a systematic way to use utensils to feed themselves. That can be done, but what's necessary is to feed them. You take a bowl of food that you've made into a mush-like substance with a big spoon, and you ladle it out into their mouth. In the buildings where the kids can't feed themselves, there are so few attendants that there's only an average, it's been timed, 3 minutes per child for feeding.
How much time would be needed to do a job adequately?
The same amount of time that your children and my children would want to have to eat breakfast.
What's the consequence of 3 minutes per meal per child?
The consequence is death from pneumonia.